back. Everybody, welcome to the show. And today we've got an incredible guest, someone that I'm really psyched, someone with a very cool, unusual in its directness Twitter handle, the one, the only, Nathan Lane. Nathan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Delighted to be here.
Awesome. Okay. There's a lot of stuff we're going to talk about in this next while. And also, just for the listener here, we're taking on a bit of a new format. We're going back to a longer format because I was just finding myself getting these cool conversations with people, but then I'm getting that kind of wrap it up signal from Patrick, who sits across from me on the computer. And I didn't want to wrap it up. So we've decided to go a longer format so that we can just talk to people. So today we're going to cover, of course, we're going to talk about leadership. We're going to talk about what Nathan does for a living. We're going to talk about where we grew up, punk, hardcore, all of that kind of stuff. And we're going to allow ourselves to really just enjoy the conversation. And I hope you get as much out of it as I believe you will. So Nathan, you're an associate professor at Oxford University, teaching economics. So tell us about that. What is that like?
It's very strange. So I'm a relatively new professor here. I started a year ago and I started in lockdown. So what it's like is I have a very distorted view of it all. But that's to say it's very strange. It's a very particular institution. I love it. It's weird and wonderful, and I'm surrounded by amazing, interesting, odd people, and it's a blast so far.
Okay, so you grew up in punk and hardcore. Is that right?
Yes, I did. I grew up in the hardcore scene, the punk and hardcore scene in the U.S. South, mainly in Florida, Georgia area, mainly in kind of central Florida. That's my background through and through.
So what were the local bands for you?
So we were unfortunate that we didn't have at that time great local bands. We had around in Florida at that time, it'd probably be, Ass Suck, Reverse Soul Man, Ass Suck, where Fear and Weapons meet, down south. Until the end. As you can see, it's super eclectic, and the stuff going on in Gainesville, which was, hot water music, Asshole Parade. It was a kind of cornucopia of a very diverse music within the parameters of punk and hardcore, which then was pretty expansive. So, yeah.
Well, first of all, let's just talk about Asshole Parade. What a name. I've never heard that band, but I had forgotten that. But that name hits me just like it did when I was younger. I was like, yeah, that's a good statement. I'm telling you that the minute we're done, I'm going to go listen to Asshole Parade for the first time, just based off this conversation.
Great fast hardcore. Great fast hardcore to skateboard to. It's fantastic.
What if it was just really soulful indie rock? It'd be
completely incongruent. But where did you grow up yourself?
I was born in Montreal. I grew up in Calgary, and then I moved to Vancouver in 1996 or 1997 to go to university, and I stayed here.
Okay. What was the scene like? What bands? I can kind of place some in my mind, but what were the bands that kind of drew you in at that time? Presumably, you might have been into stuff before then.
This is a great question. So I got into, I'm a child of the 80s. I was born in the 70s and got into music in the 80s. And like any kid of that time, I liked the first tape I ever got was the Miami Vice season 2 soundtrack from my parents for Christmas.
That's incredible. That's great.
I played that thing over and over and over. It had the current hits. It was great. And it also had Jan Hammer on it and all of this stuff. Stuff when you're a little kid and you get this idea of what being an adult would be. You wear a lot of sunglasses and a lot of pastel colors. Anyways,
blazers.
Totally. But I guess what my gateway to more aggressive music would probably be, I got into skateboarding, and skateboarding really brought me in, but it was kind of weird. No, well, not kind of weird. I think it's pretty normal, but I found stuff like DRI. I found, DRI was a really, really big one. Cause remember when you were a kid, you saw those shirts everywhere, the DRI shirts. So I was really into DRI. I was into Suicidal Tendencies. I was also into early Megadeth, Metallica. But oddly enough, like Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction really got me into like grittier, harder music, because like listening to that record, like let's say you had just taken a shower and then you put on that record. By the end of that record, you felt like you needed to take a shower again. It was just like a grimy record. And it really drew me into, even though it was a major label record and it was a huge record, it kind of got me interested in like kind of like, I guess like darker music and grimier music. So I got way into punk and way into metal. So that was definitely a part of it for sure.
I could see aesthetically being a gateway into that. Both like aesthetically, like kind of fashion. Of course, knowing full well, like that's another world from punk. But the the kind of grittiness, the riffs. Didn't they even like have? I got into hardcore through like, or I got into punk through like really basic, like finding Sex Pistols tapes and stuff like that, like lingering around. But I remember, I think they had Steve Jones, the Sex Pistols guitarist, I think did stuff with them. And I feel like some punk was kind of shining through that sound a bit. I don't know. I know maybe I'm wrong. But I remember there being this kind of like aesthetic bleed over there that I think so.
I think that's a reasonable thing to say, because just like you were saying, like guys with Metallica were wearing like, Misfits shirts.
Exactly.
And like, I found a ton of stuff. I mean, I found a ton of stuff through skateboarding, but it was more like the obvious ones: Suicidal Tendencies, DRI. Yes. And then I found obviously like kids who were involved in any kind of level of subculture, like Metallica, with like Megadeth. I followed a lot of like what t-shirts those guys were wearing. And same like Guns N' Roses. I remember Appetite for Destruction. I was like, kind of like, I don't know if I should like this. These guys look like the guys who beat me up at 7-Eleven, but like I'm kind of into it, Yeah. And I got into it all kind of by different kinds of ways. Like punk and hardcore got me in, or skateboarding got me into DRI, Suicidal Tendencies, and then I followed that rabbit hole. Kind of being like a kid that got like picked on. I was a bit, on the fringe, and I also got into like Megadeth, Metallica, and kind of by proxy, I sort of got into Slayer through all that stuff. And then stuff like Guns N' Roses got me into like, kind of like, well, I also got into like AC/DC, Led Zeppelin, like all of those things. Like I really came much more from like the dirtier kind of hard rock, and then like fast metal, like really, really fast metal. And then like kind of, I'd say like bigger punk and hardcore bands. And then like, DRI and Suicidal, I also got into like Dead Kennedys and all that. That long path led me to finding like really like hardcore, like what you and I would have called hardcore.
Yeah. What was that moment? So did you find, I think a lot of people who come through to subculture find something that kind of spiritually clicks as an outsider, as being a weirdo. Was there that moment where you stumbled upon a scene, not just listening to the records and listening to music, but you stumbled across a scene where you're like, oh, I'm not a weirdo. Oh, what's happening here? Oh, there's some maybe semblance of acceptance here. Was that happening? Did that happen for you, or was it slower than that epiphany?
Well, musically and like kind of like community wise, it's a little bit different. So musically,
I see.
It would be Minor Threat.
Yes.
When I listen to Minor Threat, because so I grew up in a Catholic household, and I went to Catholic school. But that idea, like you get taught about whatever religion people come in. It's like, oh, if you do the right things, like good things happen, and like you'll be a good person and all that. Yeah. But I grew up in a my parents were married, but I grew up in a pretty very dysfunctional household for all sorts of reasons. There's like mental health problems in the house and all sorts of stuff. So my home life was really challenged. And then I've got an exotic sounding name, and I grew up in Calgary in like the early 80s. So like
Target.
Yeah, like we were called like, my family were called like terrorists. People would make fun of like our ethnicity. So it was like I got picked on a ton, and my home life was challenging. So I remember thinking at a very early age, like, oh, this whole religion thing is kind of like, not like a clear intellectual thought, but more like you're sold this idea that, if you're a good person, you're kind and all that, the right things are going to happen. But every day I was getting like bullied at school and like pushed around and beat up. And then I'd go home to this like kind of like weird glacial environment. When I heard Minor Threat, so I was really drawn to the ideas of something being good and something being bad, because, Catholic, you're kind of grown up that
Yeah,
way.
that dichotomy.
Yeah, when I found Minor Threat was so about something. It was different than like a Megadeth or a Metallica, who are just like writing these songs that were awesome, but there wasn't like a strong moral stance on anything. And
Yes.
Minor Threat was the first band that I was aware of where it was like, this is a moral stance. It is a like, oh yeah,
Yes.
we're like the freaks over here and we're going to invest in that. And not only are we the freaks, but maybe there's something wrong with you. And I was like, oh, this is
that
it.
is absolutely, that was super compelling to me. Mm-hmm. And there was like a system to it. These people were onto something systematic about the world, had like kind of a systematic critique in ways. And one that I didn't fully appreciate at the time, but I was like, oh, there's something going on here that I don't quite grasp, but this is compelling. This is interesting to me. And this kind of speaks to me for those very reasons, I think.
Yeah. And then from a community perspective, my first show, like real deal show, was DRI when I was 15.
Amazing.
I went to the Thrash Zone tour and promptly got my nose broken my first time in the pit. So my parents dropped me off and I came home just like covered in blood afterwards and was like, that's the greatest thing ever happened. It was a crazy show, man. Like it was kind of an end of an era in Calgary, because Calgary had a huge crazy punk scene, and then it kind of went away just as me and my friends were getting into it. But it was at this place called McEwen Hall Ballroom, sold out show. It was like only what I could imagine when people like, when you see like drawings of like of what a pit would look like an agnostic front pit, like it was like that. Like there was, I'll never forget it, a headbanger jumped off of the monitors. Like this is me doing the headbanger jumping, jumped off. And it was like the parting of the Red Sea. This whole group of people got out of his way and he landed, he broke both his legs. And the show did not stop. People just like pulled him out. They're like, medic! Like, pull this guy out. And I just remember feeling like, I remember that time feeling like, oh, everyone else in the world's got it wrong. We've got it right. This is it. And that sense of like, I'd found the band that had flipped the script for me. Like, oh, all those people that are like kind of bullies or like my family's kind of screwed up and I've got these bullies and I don't quite fit in. Well, that's because they're all wrong. And here's the band who's got this like moral high ground. And I need that because now I'm not going to be the one who has the fingers pointing at me. I'm going to point them back. Yeah. And then I found this like community where I was like, oh no, this is us. This is our movement. Now, of course, as you get older, you start seeing the cracks in that. But the power of that is what I'd say is like a 14 and 15-year-old kid that turned me from being on a very destructive path to something that like led me to where I am today. Absolutely. What about for you?
No, very similar. I think, and it's why I was also curious about this, because it is funny, kind of like these epiphany stories that people have of like kind of that first kind of encounter with this community. Of course, then, not to sound like I'm not by any means old, neither are you, but like, this period of time where you had to kind of stumble upon it and there were no videos really, and you stumble upon it physically, and that kind of moment of first contact is super interesting to me. And mine was like, I remember coming across kids at my school who skateboarded and were all pumped for the first time. And it's like, oh, this is there's a community. And they told me about a show going on. This is late 90s. And there was a new venue, a new DIY venue opening. It was an Earth Crisis show in like 1998 or so. I had been to like a couple, not real shows, just kind of poked around at some things, but that was like the first one where, the door opens, you're like, what is this world? Here's a whole other world that exists of people wearing different things with different ideas, talking about different ideas very vehemently. And this is really weird and interesting. I want to be a part of it. That moment of seeing the Earth Crisis thing and seeing, passionate kids and seeing Varsity Jackets and seeing all this stuff was like, oh, I need to be part of this. Whatever this is, I need to be a part of it, because this is another universe. I felt like I had discovered something secret that I could be a part of, and that was really alluring and that was really fun. And for all the, not just a world, like an alternative one, because I surely I felt completely incongruent, in whatever it was that was mainstream culture at that time, whatever it was in middle school. So that was like a real epiphany to me emotionally, and it was lovely. It was great.
You know what's so cool about Earth Crisis?
Yeah.
Like, there's this sense of like, yo, are they allowed to say that? Like they were saying and doing things in such a like totally bold way. And like, whether or not people like Earth Crisis, I love Earth Crisis. I still love Earth Crisis. I feel they're like one of the most important bands, not just in punk and hardcore. I just think they're an important band, period. Think of the idea here of like change. And I'm gonna kind of dovetail into something about addiction and mental health in a second, if that's okay with you.
Yeah.
They see a problem. They look at the system around it and they're like, the system around this is not going to create any kind of change. Maybe they're going to resist the change, but if change comes, it's going to come by degrees. Why don't we just go start a band and talk about this? Now, I don't think that like a bunch of little kids were thinking that way, but that was the progression. And the idea of like direct community action. How many people are vegan and vegetarian because of Earth Crisis?
Oh, no doubt. That's what I would not be vegetarian or I would not be any of these things if it were not for Earth Crisis. And seeing it done in a way that was acceptable, seeing other young people talk about something, with conviction, and seeing people kind of, take it upon themselves to kind of realize a grassroots movement, so a grassroots social movement, which was kind of going on around them. That was something that was really inspiring, kind of eye-opening to me at that time. I had never seen anything like that. Oh, people are involved in social change too. I had no repertoire, no kind of compass for these things. And seeing, I was like entirely empowering, and seeing people like not too much older than me talking about things and making zines and going to protests. Like handing out flyers at shows and go to this. There's a protest here. This is important. You could do that? It just never occurred to me that we had that power within ourselves to do those types of things within a shitty town. And so, there's something about that was like super, super empowering. It still is to me.
It totally is. And what I found interesting, it's like, really, this always blows my mind. So you can have people who are really involved in the idea of like creating change and making a difference in all of that. And they are super open to the different avenues and the different voices and the different ways. And even if it's something maybe they find personally threatening, they'll become curious about it. Like, what do I know? And then you can have people who are absolutely interested in change, but only change from like the way they want it in their perspective and in a voice that they feel comfortable with. And you can always, for me, like Earth Crisis is always kind of a defining band. Like when people are like, but like Earth Crisis, they're like, blah, blah. It's like, come on. Like when you're talking about animal rights, vegetarianism, or even creating social change, it's like inarguably Earth Crisis of like Minor Threat, Earth Crisis, Youth of Today, Los Crudos.
Los Crudos, absolutely.
Like there are very specific bands that you can identify and being like, oh, those bands like changed everything, like every single thing. And when people hate on them or like, hey, you could not like hardcore at all. You could maybe hate hardcore, but if you look at any of those bands and say, oh, those bands changed everything and made a huge social impact. If you're downing on that, then like you probably want change, but you only want it in your own specific way. And that's going to limit your impact.
Yes.
I'm just a firm believer of like, listen to different voices, bring in different things, like pay attention to things, even if you find them scary, because there's like huge gems there.
Absolutely. Completely agree there. Especially because, we surely don't always agree with all the bands and the way they were going about politics, particularly in that scene, because there's so much heterogeneity and people dabbling in some pretty radical ideas for the best and the worst. But even within that range, I still appreciate that people were doing something and experimenting and kind of putting the rubber to the road in ways that were like entirely creative and self-generated And again, to repeat myself, and pretty empowering. And what I think is interesting to your point too, is that like, I look at everyone around me too, given the heterogeneous people who are kind of attracted to hardcore and punk. Here are people who could have easily been, my friends were knuckleheads. Like I could have easily been a knucklehead, and like are now getting into political ideas they would never, ever, ever have touched. They'd never have touched that in a million years. Like would the jock on my football team be in animal rights? Otherwise, no, like, and that's the kind of powerful thing too, is that you see that change can enter into people's lives through, very non-prescriptive ways, through these grassroots movements and through what these bands were doing. And I still think about that all the time, that like, I think it brought political awareness to people who would not have otherwise been politically aware at all. And that to me, I like, is something I deeply value.
Totally.
Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. And actually, as we're talking more about this, I'd be remiss, of course, if I didn't mention the legendary Bikini Kill, another band that's like changed everything. Totally. And there's so many more. Yeah. Like as I was talking, I'm like, oh, I can't forget Bikini Kill. Like
Bikini Kill, yeah.
And I don't know if you were aware of them when they were a band, but I remember how people reacted to them and how people felt about it. And it was like,
what is this? No. Right? Yeah.
And like, think how their impact. I know people talk about their impact, but it's incalculable what they did. Like incalculable the amount of change that they help usher in, and thinking to help usher in.
Absolutely, I would have never. I remember, because this is like right around maybe the crest of the Riot Grrrl movement. Mm-hmm. I would have not encountered those ideas were it not for the kind of bands in the satellite kind of circling, orbiting Bikini. I never saw Bikini Kill. Tigre had just formed, but yeah, those bands, Bratmobile came through. I remember these bands coming through and being like, what is this? What? Oh, the things I'm saying might suck, or, oh, I shouldn't drop the F-bomb as a skateboarder. Like hearing this discourse for the first time. I heard it through them and kind of people who were getting these ideas through them. And it made me think about the world completely differently in much more sensitive ways. And I credit the kind of Riot Grrrl movement for doing that and encountering those people. And they changed my life totally. All those, the people in my community who were kind of tangential to that scene, that world.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you say that, like, being kind of like a lughead, grew up in Calgary, like I grew up in I was like out on the fringes, but I was also a byproduct of growing up in like, a very specific time in the 80s in Calgary. And like, I remember a lot of those ideas, like I felt very threatened by them. Like, what do you mean? And then just being like, oh, I get it now. Yeah. And I wouldn't have been exposed to any of those ideas if it wasn't for those records and the conversations. And also for every, let's say, 2 great conversations you had about that, maybe there was like 20 really stupid conversations that was around that. But like, this is gems of knowledge and young people figuring it out together. Sometimes predominantly in awful ways, but sometimes in these really incredible ways where it's like, wow, I'm like different as a result of that record, that conversation, that zine, that show. So here's where I wanted to talk about straight edge and mental health. Prior to what I do now, I worked as an addiction and mental health therapist for about 10 years in Vancouver.
Wow.
And the surrounding area. And I had this boss at the time. His name was Patrick. And he was like just really weird cat. Like I could say a lot of stuff here, but he was just like a zany character, and he'd get really obsessed about things. And I started working there, and he found out about that I played in punk bands. So he starts like looking me up online and stuff. And he calls me into his office one day, and I thought, here we go. What's going to happen? Because, it's like most punks have kind of got a fear of your boss, right? I'm like, oh God, what's going to happen? He's like, I want to talk to you about straight edge. I was like, oh no. This is not what I was expecting. And he asked me to talk to him about it. And of course he asked, is it like gang related? All the things that you think will happen.
Yes.
He actually asked me if I was in a gang, by the way. Like I was like, oh God, I'm in like my professional career that I went to school for and worked hard, and I'm being asked if I'm in a gang. Because
all these these specials were being blasted at that time. My middle school, we couldn't wear any straight edge stuff because it was a gang. It was a gang symbol. 60 Minutes John Stossel specials that kind of like scared the bejesus out of everyone. Absolutely. No. So what happened?
Well, first of all, I could just let's also just say the media at this point is just like mainstream media is like horrific. Like it is just the worst. My boss then said to me, like he got really interested and I told him the whole gave him kind of an oral history of straight edge and everything. And he's like, so let me get this straight. A bunch of kids have decided to create a subculture together where you don't drink and you don't do drugs and you want to have a positive mindset. And I was like, right. He's like, and people typically stay straight edge for how long? I'm like, well, it's supposed to be this lifetime commitment, but let's just say people say sober between 2 to 15 years. And he's like, whoa, wait a second. So you're telling me that the kind of approval or the hit rate, the positive rate would be people would stay sober in these very crucial periods of their life. They would be sober and surrounded with people who are trying to act or think positively. I was like, yeah, I guess on the surface that would be it. He's like, do you realize that governments all over the world sink millions of dollars into programs to get kids to not do drugs and to have improved mental health and to form strong, healthy bonds and to treat each other with respect and all this? They sink millions of dollars and have abysmal failures in it when you and a bunch of people, or not me, but a bunch of kids just decided they're not going to do that. And it cost $0. And I was like, huh, that's a crazy. Yeah, I never thought of that way. He was like, if that's not the power of community organizing, what is? And it made me kind of like, how incredible is it? It's just being like, oh, you don't drink, I don't drink. Let's put this mark on our hand. Yeah, and then you've got suddenly hundreds of thousands, well, maybe tens of thousands of people all over the world who are making what arguably or inarguably is somewhat of a healthy choice for whatever period of time. And it achieves something that actual experts can't get kids to stop smoking weed, but their peers can.
Absolutely. What was, and it exactly what you're saying reminds me of, wasn't there a failed ad campaign by, I'm butchering it now, but it was a commercial. Maybe Council for Drug-Free America, or maybe it might have been a U.S. government agency that did it. They sponsored kind of a straight edge. You're smiling, so you might know what I'm talking about.
I totally know what you're talking about.
Yeah, where it was a bunch of kids talking about youth crew music, and they might have been. Were they even repeating Minor Threat lyrics?
Yeah,
I don't know whatever happened.
There were a few different versions of it. One had the Minor Threat lyrics, and it was Porcell, Ken Olden was in it.
Yes.
And there was another one where this dude Gordo was going to a record store and buying records.
Yeah. That's the one I remember. The latter. That's that kind of reminds me of why was, I mean, thank God it wasn't harvested in nefarious ways but that's super interesting that what you're saying reminds me of that. So wait, were you working at, was this a center? Was this an inpatient unit? What was this you were working at?
Outpatient. Outpatient counseling, yeah.
Was it specifically for drugs and rehabilitation?
It was for drugs and mental health.
How did being straight edge interact with that situation? How did it inform being straight edge at that point? Because you're seeing it from a whole other perspective.
So when you get that feeling I told you when suddenly I could start pointing back at the world and being like, you're wrong, you're screwed up. I remember when I got my first job out of that. And I'd grown, like I said, I grew up in Calgary, truly middle class, maybe lower middle class, but truly middle class. And I mean, I suffered and struggled and all the things I talked to you about, but I never experienced poverty. I never experienced violence in my home. I never experienced I didn't experience a lot of the things that would lead people down a challenging path. Yes. Becoming a therapist and addiction therapist really was a very sharp, hard lesson in how limited the idea of straight edge and how limited the idea of punk can be.
Yes.
If you stick in that black and white of good and bad.
Yeah.
And it can be super powerful if you're willing to be flexible and apply it to different things. And if what it taught me was cause I was very much straight edge guy, like, da da da. It's like, whatever ridiculous things you want to apply to it. Like my email address was like xaramx@hotmail. And you just hit a point where you're like, oh, I don't want this to be the front line of like how I interact with people at all because it's stupid. And I don't want to turn people off because like all sorts of people interact with all sorts of substances and all sorts of different diets, and that doesn't make them good or bad people. And I'm limiting my life. I don't want to look at my life through like a keyhole. Like I don't want to look at the world through a keyhole. So that it was a big, sharp reminder of like how valuable and incredible other people are, despite what they decide to or not put into their bodies or eat or whatever. Yes. And the other thing is like, you can't really help people if your starting point is judgment. And it was a hard lesson in not being a shithead. Yeah.
I can imagine that was, sobering. That would have been immediately, that would make me immediately confront a lot of the ways I went about being straight edge. Absolutely. At least at my age when I was younger. And I remember, I never would see it through the lens of a counselor, a mental health professional, someone in your position. But I remember when, because this is Florida in late 90s through 2000s when the meth epidemic was hitting and the opioid epidemic was kind of starting. Mm-hmm. And so starting to see that thing, that kind of machine, which has killed so many people, kind of start percolating, start ramping up, and the pill mills in Florida start ramping up. Seeing that like start was really sobering, like, oh, something, and it was a weird interaction that like, it made me more convicted in my own internal beliefs about this thing, which we call straight edge, but it completely changed the way I politically experience it and the way I articulate it in my daily life, because suddenly like, there's a lot of people around me dying, or a lot of people who are addicts, and it is a kind of a shitty town which had a lot of these problems. It's like, oh, this isn't going to cut it being a cartoon, because these are real people, and and we're having to engage in a whole different politics now. And now it's a full blown epidemic in the U.S. So I can only imagine like a leading indicator, you kind of confronting that from the vantage point of delivering mental health services to people. How long did you stay in that role? How long did you stay there?
10 years in various roles. First was like youth addiction, mental health, and then I did housing for underhoused populations, and then back to adult addiction, or then into adult addiction. And 10 years was a good run. I really great job, great work. I guess what pushed me out of it, not pushed me out.
That was my question.
What got me out of it was, and what got me interested in what I do now is like leadership. A lot of those organizations, they just can't afford to train leaders, and they're not typically, except for maybe very, very senior levels, like hiring leaders, so to say. Like they're hiring who's the last person standing. It's like, everyone's quit, you're the boss, or like the standards for leadership, at least when I worked in the not-for-profit sector, were extremely low. And you just found these organizations that like were doing good work. Like the frontline workers are doing great. The therapists were doing great. The office staff was doing great. Everyone's just doing what they can.
Yes.
They're doing great is maybe not the best term. They're doing the best that they can based on how they understand their own performance, what they understand about collaboration, working together. But I found my experience in not-for-profits, the cultures I worked in 3 different places, and the culture from place to place was toxic. It was terrible, and the leadership was awful. And it wasn't because the people were bad at all. Like, they're great. It's that, there's so little money to go around for training and all these things. And the focus is often about like helping people and getting in there and direct action and doing that.
Yes.
These things are kind of like talent mills. You've got all these young people who are coming in with the best of intentions, and they just get pulverized, and they often get stuck in jobs. And then you see these really bitter professionals who, not always, and I don't want to speak in generalities,
of course,
but you see a lot of professionals just get burnt out, having mental health crises of their own, sinking into addiction themselves, really unhappy in their jobs. And all of it is based on like the poor leadership. I just hit a point where I'd had enough of working in toxic cultures and working with, these just terrible bosses. So I decided I'm going to try something new. And I was walking down the street with my dog one day. I have like a wiener dog, and his name is Blue. And he's a very distinct looking dog because he's actually kind of like wine rhino colored. So he's called Blue. And I'm walking down the street and I ran into this dude who started talking to me about my dog. He's like, "Oh, your dog's amazing." We start chatting. He's like, "Oh, what do you do for a living?" I'm like, "I'm a therapist." He's like, "Well, I run an executive coaching company. We're looking for a therapist to come in and work for us. Would you be interested in talking about it?" And it was so serendipitous that I was like, "Okay."
Hey,
that's what brought me down my path.
What was your view? I think as people coming from subculture, maybe because you were in the mental health space, you might have had a different view of coaching, of leadership, of these words that I myself had, for whatever reason, a knee-jerk kind of negative impression of, or dismissive impression of it. Maybe you didn't. What was your perception of like the world of coaching, the world of leadership, these things that you're so into now at that moment when you met this guy?
I thought it was corny.
Yeah.
But I'd only been exposed to corny things.
Yes.
And the guy that I worked for was ultra corny. And the company that he has is like unbelievably corny, like really corny. But it was really cool because like I went in, I took this leap and instantly was like, I went from like this very toxic culture that I was working in into a complete madhouse. It was like a different kind of madhouse. Like the first week that I worked at my other job, someone hit me in the head with a laptop case, like a soft laptop case. I was working on my computer. Someone just whacked me on the head with it, which would never happen to me. So it was like having like a little brother suddenly, like someone sprayed perfume in my face. Someone whacked me on the head with all the first week I was working there. People were like openly talking about like really like graphically talking about sex. And I was like, oh my God. Like, and I'd just come from the social services and I was like, what is this madhouse I've joined?
Yeah.
I ran into my boss on commercial. It was like a street in Vancouver. And he started I was with my friends. It was like a weekend. And he started like grilling me about work stuff in front of my friends in like the first 2 weeks that I was working there. And I was like, this is the worst thing. I've made a terrible life decision, but like I'd made the decision. So I just buckled down. I learned the industry. And as I was learning the industry, I was juxtaposing. I was like, here's the stuff that this company is getting me to do. And it's so corny. And there's some gems in it, but it's really corny. But here's all of this other really cool stuff that's out there, like Brene Brown, the people that I'm like really like inspired by. And it's like, oh, there's actually super cool stuff here. And in fact, my therapeutic background, if I could get more in that area. And so like, it was almost like the first 2 months that I was working at this company, I was like, I need to start my own company. And I just went in with like a learner's mind. I learned as much as I could. And also like I was into staying there if we could kind of steer the company in a cooler direction. And we kind of started getting there. But the corny dude was just too corny. Like he just wanted it to go. He wanted to have like a cornfield. And I couldn't do it, man. I was like, dude, I got to go this way.
I can't.
I started my own company based on like therapeutic practices and a coaching perspective. And now it's like I in a weird way, this detour into really corny stuff helped me define what is it that I don't like.
Yes.
I'm not going to do that so that I can focus on the things I do like.
Yes. Was it, this makes complete sense. I'm nodding because it's somewhat similar. No, it's something that seems completely reasonable. And it's something that also resonates with me a bit. How scared? Because me, I'm a scared person. I'm a terrified person. How terrifying? When did you know you were going to make that leap? And was it terrifying? For me, those types of leaps were always just completely, nerve-wracking to realize that, like this new job, this cornball I'm working with, this isn't going to cut it. I have to go out on my own. Was that a terrifying experience for you?
Totally terrifying.
No? Okay.
It was super terrifying. And it's scary now. Like, I mean, we're 5 years in and we've got like a proven track record. I talked about this recently. Like, so I've always taken a lot of leaps in my life. like quitting my job to go on tour and like all the stuff that people do, right? And
Sure.
and I'd actually say 110% playing in the punk scene is what set me up for this. Like, it's a risk. It's not a risk starting a band, but it's a risk playing a show. It's a risk because you're like putting yourself out there. Like, do we suck or not? It's a risk getting up on stage.
Everyone will have an opinion. People will tell you things, and people tell. Like, in the act of producing something, you realize even within this tiny, it could be something infinitesimal that you're putting out. I was always petrified of reactions to things, and seeing that reaction first to like making a zine, and it's like it hits you in the face. And I look at as many things. We don't produce things as people often, and we do for work and stuff, but we aren't like the residual claimants on what we do. And in punk, where it's like you're kind of given the means of production, you're producing things for people, you immediately are confronted with like the reality of what it means to produce something, which is like people are going to respond to it, and often in a very vocal way, and in a place where like people are very opinionated. That's a terrifying thing. That's a terrifying place to be. And that's something I learned to deal with, I think, really quickly and really early on that I don't think I would have otherwise have encountered at all.
The ability to manage criticism is, I believe, one of the most valuable life tools that you can have. And I don't just mean criticism, but I also mean critique when people are picking apart your efforts. I have a saying, and I live by it: believe your own shit and be fully willing to be told you're full of shit at any given time. And what I mean by that is like, you should totally believe in what you do. If you're doing it, you should believe that you have something of immense value to add, to give, to provide, to inspire. You should believe in your own shit, like 100%. And if someone's like, you believe in your shit, you should be like, well, yeah, like who else's shit am I supposed to believe in? Yours? Like, like believe in your shit. And you have to be willing to have someone be like, oh, that sucks. Because your next question should be like, okay, tell me, like, what are the parts that suck?
Yes.
Because even in the most blasé, ridiculous criticism could lie a nugget. And it doesn't mean that like, you let's say you like, put out a song and then some like person yells from a car, like, you suck. It's not like you want to chase them down and be like, tell me what sucks. But what I'd say is if someone is going to critique you, if someone's criticizing you, I invite critique. Be like, okay, well, tell me about it. Like, I want the critique. Move away from criticism. Don't say I suck. Tell me why I suck. Get to the details. But you can't do that with every single person. But you should be willing to, if someone has any kind of significant track record of success in anything that's related to what you're doing, you should invite the critique. If like someone's like, your band is corny or your company is corny, and they actually have like a track record of a business person or someone who's made music or someone who's made zines, would be like, great, okay, tell me what's corny specifically. Like, let's talk about it. Like, tell me what sucks. If you can get comfortable with if someone's criticizing you to invite critique, or if someone's critiquing you to dig in with it, you've got a skill that will take you throughout your entire life. Yes.
And I think through everything, what you're saying does resonate a lot. I think because I would see bands and I would see people's products emerge so rudimentary and often so bad. And you would see very quickly a trajectory of growth in people that was very salient and very palpable. And you could see someone, playing a little house show in a terrible band, putting out terrible 7-inches, then being something of importance and producing things that were good. And you could see that evolution before your eyes. At least I would. And that would be really inspiring. And it made me be less fearful of sucking at first, because you just have to suck at something when you first do it. You're going to. Yeah. And having the space to suck and kind of to embody sucking and to kind of get told critiques and to like learn, and having that space to do that was, I think, really, and that was the nice thing about DIY is I think, it gave us the space. It gave one the space to kind of adjust and grow and be imperfect, which I think is necessary and great. And it got me over. I would have been completely petrified to do anything that wasn't absolutely airtight, perfect, et cetera, et cetera. It made me get over my own perfectionism and to seek out the types of critiques which you're now like kind of celebrating, which are now integral to everything I do now. So yeah. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense, man. And so like to bring it back to starting the business, like, yeah, I was terrified. And I remember sitting with two of my colleagues, my former colleagues one day, and we were all just like, we just had enough. We just had enough of this company. And the three of us were like, well, okay, we could sit around and talk shit, or we could do something. We should do something. And we like had this like really like big conversation about it. Like, we're going to do something. And sure enough, you know, when like the rubber hit the road, I don't want to say this is because of punk or not, but it takes a certain kind of person to leave the nest, and it takes a certain kind of person when you're in like, you seek safety or you go hard. And I went out on my own, did this thing. One of them is no longer at that company. They went on to do something else, but was there for years and was not stoked for years, like stayed not stoked.
Yeah.
And the other one stayed and kind of like rose to quite a significant level in the company. And I believe is relatively like stoked, is like pretty happy that they stayed. But the whole thing is like, I think anyone can talk shit. And like, I don't like to I like to talk shit, but like, I don't like to sit in my own shit. I don't want to sit there and be like, man, this sucks. It's like, well, then go do something else. And it's really important for me. And like, kind of one of the different things that I think about is like, you know, you could be a bystander and just basically be like, that sucks, but I'm unwilling to do something about it.
Yes.
Or you could be someone who is there to collaborate, and you're like, that sucks, and I'm willing to work with others, but not take the lead. Like, I don't want to take the lead, but I'll be willing to work with others and kind of create that change if someone else puts in the effort. Or you could be a leader. You can be like, that sucks, and I'm going to put myself out front, and I'm going to bring together all the powers, and we're all going to work together. And none of those things are bad. You know, like, I don't want to say if someone's a bystander, they're a bad person, but it's like, I don't know, like if you choose to say something sucks and you don't want to do anything with it, your complaining should probably be curtailed a little bit versus someone who's like, you know what, I think that sucks and I am willing to work on it, but I'm not going to be the person who puts myself out front. Then I think you can complain a little bit more because you're like willing to make that change. But if you're a leader and you say something sucks, like, it's the act of taking on that change for me, which is that like, oh, I'm going to push change. You're going to get shit. People are going to criticize you. People are going to hate on you.
Yes.
But if you're willing to do it and take that spot, it's a huge thing. And I also think you got a little bit more room to complain there because you're actually like in the fray, like making a difference.
Yeah. No. It all makes complete sense. How, for you, were there archetypes or were there people, were there stories that feel like hardcore and punk, there's a lot of mythology and there's a lot of, you know, book your own, this band could be your life, book your own fucking tour, you know, all these books, these templates that kind of show you the template of how to do something on your own. And for me, those maybe kind of subconsciously, those always kind of demonstrated some, template for leadership or some template for doing something. And I think even when I create a new lab, we're creating a new lab right now, a new research lab, the way we're going about it, I know I caught myself the other day, it sounds maybe, you know, I'm not lying, but it's like, I thought about, reading about Discord records and how they were figuring out how to put together records and ungluing the record sleeves and to figure out how do you put these things together and backward engineering something that seems kind of insurmountable and undoable and beyond you. And to me, that kind of stuck in my head. And that's still, I think, the way I go about things is like in this lab, we're trying to, what does this other guy do? Oh, it's not that hard. Oh, let's kind of reverse. It's reversible. It's reverse engineer. There's a way to do this. And to me, those stories always stuck out as like really empowering because it showed me like, oh, that's a template that can be applied to multiple things. Was that the same for you? Maybe I'm reaching, but like those things really haunt me still in a good way.
All the way, man. Like all the way. And this is like, It's so interesting because, like, when we ask people to be on the podcast, very often we hear people say, well, it's like, I don't really think of myself as a leader. It's like a leader to me is not necessarily about leading people. It's about like leading ideas, leading change. And it can involve leading people, but it's about like kind of pushing the envelope and creating change and being willing to do that, like to stand out. I think of that Discord stuff is just, and also I'll tie it back to Earth Crisis and like Bikini Kill and Youth of Today and Crudos and all of that. It's like, let's say someone gets into punk and hardcore and they directly learn something from, let's say, Discord. Like, wow, they reverse engineered their records and like the covers and all of that. That person has been changed from that because they understand something about like, oh, well, there's this huge system, the music industry. These people just sat down and literally pulled apart covers. They figured it out and they did it.
Yes.
It changes their idea of how to interact with systems. Now, so you've got this one person, and let's say that person is into punk and hardcore for like 3 years and then is gone, or 2 years or 3 months or whatever, but they've learned that about Discord. That person carries the seed of that idea to every single other person that they meet. And they might be like, oh yeah, well think like, like independent record labels, this is how they do it. Or they might not even phrase it that way, but they might be like, well, why don't we just reverse engineer this? The idea that like direct action and just these like little, like, like some CEO somewhere might be like, well, what does Minor Threat have to do with me? I'm like, it's not about Minor Threat, the band. It's about how they approached breaking down problems and creating something based on their own ideas.
Yes.
And that's how we can create real change in the world. And it's so crazy how like these little communities and these little things of direct action that especially at the time just seemed like little kids getting one over on the system like changed the world.
Yeah. Yeah. No, and I absolutely. And I see, maybe it's, what you say, it makes a lot of sense because it's like, I don't want to say red pilled or, it's like you start looking at the world differently through this different lens. And I start seeing commonalities in other, dare I say subcultures, other communities that have these same spirits. And I see the success of these things in those worlds too. I think I interact a lot with the hacker community, the machine learning AI community. I see the kind of DIY kind of code sharing. No, this isn't that hard. It looks complicated. It's not that hard. Here's how you do it. I see that same spirit there and its success there. And that always makes me excited. It always makes me realize, oh, this thing isn't just specific to subculture or to punk. These are ideas that, like you said, are kind of, more profound than that and have meaning elsewhere. But it also kind of like, I think allowed me to interact in much different communities in much the same way I interacted with punk. Oh, it's the same thing. And that's a gift that keeps on giving.
It is, man. And like, I think about, and I can still just clearly remember the time I saw a Minor Threat record, the very first time. Yeah. It was like getting, so, I'm a young kid, I'm a teenager in Calgary, like been like called names all my life, like beat up, like pushed aside, like, I'm a skateboarder, but in Calgary, you can only skateboard a certain amount of the time because it's like cold the whole time. There's gravel on the streets. So you just entrenched in this identity as a skateboarder, but also like, my home life was really challenging. And I just remember feeling like the world is bad. Like I'm in a bad world. And I remember looking at that Minor Threat record and it was as if someone threw me a lifeline. And that lifeline, if I just held on to it and I read and I listened and I learned and I applied myself, it would pull me into the future.
Yes.
And it took me from being this teenager who felt like the world around me is full of superpowers that I've got nothing I can do against.
Yes.
And I'm going to be bullied and beat up and pushed aside for the rest of my life, to feeling, oh no, like I've got power and I'm going to use this power. And then as I got older and I learned life lessons, it still helped guide me. And that's why so much of what we do in Cadence, in my business, it's so governed by punk, and why very often many of the guests we have on the podcast are from the punk scene, but they're doing like real deal, like leadership and business stuff.
Absolutely. What you're saying also reminds, do you think, because, and I imagine you were too, you were in bands, you're like deeply ensconced in this world. Were there things that you felt deficient in because of punk? I think there were some things too, for me, that I had to unlearn, maybe some of the rough edges of punk, or I wasn't cognizant of or as attuned to because of punk. Were there any liabilities, you think, coming into your space, coming into the world that punk didn't endow you with?
Yes, but you first. What about for you?
For me, it was goal setting. There were all these things which I was super dismissive of. Maybe like leadership too. I didn't realize we were embodying leadership with what we were doing often. That like in kind of recruiting people into our cult that is hardcore punk. That was like leadership. Implicitly that's leadership. There's a leadership aspect to what we're doing. But then there was these finalities that I completely ignored. For instance, I didn't realize like things like goal setting, the importance of goals, and kind of these things which I was very dismissive of. Just like some of the bigger ideas within leadership, I wasn't attuned to. That took me a while to be like, oh, this thing just isn't the type of fodder that fills books, hardcover books at airports. This is like real stuff, and actually is really important, and really important people and thoughtful people actually find this stuff to be more goal setting. For all we talk about discipline, and I think there is like this kind of machismo discipline thing within hardcore. I realized I needed much more of that too. I knew it aesthetically. No, these things matter. Haha, we're disciplined. We don't do drugs, or we don't eat meat. But the discipline to kind of stay motivated, to apply PMA day in and day out through a slog of something that sucks, and not to say, hey, this sucks. That was something that was very new to me that I had to like learn. Do those two things? Those are two things that stand out. Yeah.
Totally. So I'll add to that. My first was my opinion on everything does not matter.
Yeah.
So like punk and hardcore, it's like, I think of Uniform Choice, like screaming for change. It's like, like what I think about everything is super important and you need to know about it. It's like, listen, what I think about everything is important to me and maybe a few other people, but not to the world in general. And also my knowledge and expertise, and even like my uninformed opinion on things is not necessary. Like I should speak to things that I have an ability to really add value to a conversation. And more often than not, I should be listening way more than I'm speaking. Yeah. So that was like something I had to really learn. And there's a great quote from Billy Rubin, who sang in Half Off, that I talk a lot about how he had to learn. Like, it was really tough going to in the corporate world, or into not corporate world, but into his career.
Is he corporate?
He's not. I don't think he's corporate. He's a photographer. I don't know what he does for a living.
Oh.
Maybe he does that for a living. He has this great quote in a Vice interview, and I'm going to butcher it, so I'll just say just basically he said, like, I had to very quickly unlearn that everything that I thought about everything did not matter. It took up space. It derailed conversation, and I had to work to change that. I had to work to change that. I'd like pontificate, like, like give you my opinion on everything, and you could just see people just be like, at first they're captivated because I'm confident, I can speak well. They're like, wow. But after like a few months, they're like, man, wish this guy would shut up. I don't care what you think. So that was
content to this.
Oh, absolutely. Is there content? Are you adding value right now? That was the first. The second is that like punk and hardcore is like, it's so cool, but it's extremely rules based, and it's very conformist. And like, it's unbelievable. For anyone listening who's like uninitiated, punk and hardcore is unbelievably conformist. Like it's different than the rest of the world, but within group, it's extremely conformist. And something that I learned that I had to unlearn is, and it sounds like a little bit of what you had to learn, is like a deep dismissiveness of anyone that didn't fit with an extremely tight parameter of what I thought was good or bad. And punk is like, I don't want to say this is everyone's experience, but like, it's unbelievably conformist. And I've really lost my taste for a lot of the community aspect of it because of that, because it's so conformist. So that, and what I found for me was that it limited my connections to other people, my friendships with other people, like my interactions, the value I'd place on people's thinking. And that's not punk's fault. It's my fault for kind of like falling for that, but I was really conditioned that way.
Oh, so it's alluring. It's alluring.
And the third thing is kind of false icons. And I can't say this is a punk thing, but I grew up Catholic. So like I always wanted to have like really clear delineations of good and bad, hero, villain. And coming up in punk, you're really set up to think like people are good people. Like, I'm straight edge and vegan. Well, you're a good person. Or I'm about this. Well, you're a good person. Oh, you're not about this. You're a bad person. And very much like I grew up with like really idolizing and looking up to people and like really wanting to be accepted by people that I kind of view as like successful. It's like, oh no, like you put out like a cool record when you were 20 and that's like about the extent of it. Doesn't mean that's bad, but like certainly I shouldn't be seeking your approval, and you're certainly not like of any kind of like moral authority in my life. I'm a, like that's for each human being. And it really primed me up to create idols. And I really had to step out of that and be like, well, what's someone bringing to the table now? Not the record they partially wrote when they were like 23 years old.
Yes. It made me highly attuned to, who's that producer who produced, who was in Big Black?
Steve Albini.
It's an interview where he talks about the micro celebrity phenomena of punk and how kind of pernicious that is. And I think that, that's something that hit hard with me. And something I also see kind of replicated in my own, very tiny world here, like in the academic world. Is we believe our own narratives and our own coolness for producing things that have meaning. And it might be really amazing for very specific audiences, for very specific people. And we start to believe in our own, we drink our own Kool-Aid. That's not a PC thing to say, but we believe our own hype. And I would see the degree to which people would buy into that and in really flawed ways. And that was something that really scared me. And that was something that like I still kind of often reflect on because I see it in all other spaces now. It's kind of like, oh, we start thinking we're really hot shit. We're really cool things. When what we know, actually what we're doing is like extremely limited sometimes. We should feel great for it, but it doesn't mean we're better people. It doesn't mean, and that's something that really holds over. When you said the parameters of how kind of defining and limited and how kind of tight we police the boundaries of what punk and hardcore is, that's something too that really I needed to grow out of. And that's something I really needed to, I hope is better now too. I get the sense, and that's something that I felt was really damaging too. And the way as like people trying to keep together these, I think there's reasons why we have such tight parameters and incoherent parameters and why we police them so strangely and so kind of viciously sometimes. But that's my one regret too, looking back, is like, I think we would have been much more impactful if we weren't so obsessed with these super temporal, fleeting parameters that we were always trying to enforce. Why? I don't know why. Like things that were so arbitrary. I think we would have been way more effective as a community had we not do that. And I see, maybe I'm wrong now, but I hope the younger kids are a bit better. I'm hoping they are. I don't know.
I mean, I think, so, like people kind of getting shit for not being like straight edge anymore. Like that. Like I think about something like that. I can't speak to anyone else. I know when I was young, in my mind, it was always about like kind of like, busting someone's balls. Like, you got to make fun of someone.
Yeah.
Or it would be like, oh, are you okay? Like, I just want to check in you're okay. And it's like, both are just like, so like, dude, that's like so fucked that you would act that way towards someone just because they decide to like have a drink or smoke weed or whatever.
Yeah.
And what I really realized is it was about my insecurity, about my own uncertainty of who I was. And that I wanted conformity. I want us all to be straight edge. I want us all to be about the same thing. And if you break that chain, well, what does that say about me? And it's a weird way of like making the whole world about you. And when I started realizing that, I remember I was joking around with a friend. Well, I thought I was joking around with a friend of mine, and he was really upset. And he was like, it affected our friendship for years afterwards. And finally years later, he was like, it really hurt my feelings when I stopped being straight edge that you like made fun of me, and you really made fun of me about it. And I was like, oh, I thought I was just busting your balls. And he was like, yeah, but dude, who cares? And I felt so embarrassed. and like we were adults, right? And I was like, at this point, I was like, I'm so sorry. And the entitlement that I felt at that time, but so much of it was like group dynamics, like who's on top of the group, like,
Yes.
you're still figuring yourself out. You're figuring out your identity. So I think a lot of that, so not just straight edge, but like kind of punk and policing things and like what's cool and not cool. So much of it is about like social real estate. Like what kind of social real estate do you take up in a group? Like what do you like? What do you not like? What's your ability to govern what other people should or should not like? A lot of that is about your sense of self and how comfortable you are with yourself and how you interact with the world. And as I've gotten older, I'd like to feel that I'm older is not the right way that I want to phrase it, because I know a lot of young people who don't act like shitheads. But
absolutely.
I would say for myself, the more that I grew in life and became more centered in myself, the less I was like that. And also like the more embarrassed I've gotten about like, oh, I can't believe I said or did that,
Yes. I was really, my authenticity, I think, was really kind of fragile sometimes. And I was really, and there was like a kind of, cannibalistic urge to show who was more authentic than, but I think it was permeating subculture that time. I think read the 90s stuff. There's like this obsession with authenticity. You watch Clerks. So there's like, who's a poser, who's not, blah, 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 blah. Which I feel like hopefully might be a bit transcended now.
I think it's working its way out in different ways. Like, I mean, I think a lot of like political movements, like super incredible, important political movements, I think fall a little bit of prey who's like, who's more like that than versus like who, like that kind of like looking for cracks in everybody. And it's interesting because it's like, these are such incredible, like such important movements and ideas and all that, but you can see their momentum gets stymied by that cannibalistic urge of like self-governing. I don't think it's like a punk thing. I think it's very much a people passionate about something and pushing for something. It becomes at some point much like you can push it to a certain degree where there's like rapid or at least seeming like rapid change, but then the rest of that change or ongoing change, it's like really requires diligent, hard effort. And it becomes a little easier just to like kind of like poke at the person to the left and the right of you than like look at yourself or to keep pushing forward. I can't fault anyone for doing that. I mean, I certainly have done that in my life, like many times. But I think it's a bit of a human failing of like creating change, especially change that is so anti whatever the dominant cultural view is. Once you hit a point where it's like you've had a momentum, but the going gets rough, it might be a little bit more appealing just to start attacking people who are actually like working with you.
Yes. I think I saw the same because I went from hardcore and I'm still involved. I still go to shows, but I'm not like, I don't know like who the cool band is anymore. I don't know who the cool people are. I'm kind of like, I'm a distant, onlooker now, and I got more into activism. After this, I could see these same dynamics at play, and it made me a little more sensitive to these things. Seeing it play out in our affinity groups, or seeing it play out in our kind of like, our little cell that we have, our book, our goddamn reading group. These little things we have, and it's like this kind of like, and it made me much more sensitive to letting people have the space to kind of, not fall within the parameters of what we think is an ideal activist, but also like people are, and I was bad at this too in punk, when I was deeply involved in punk, people are still kind of figuring things out and not always going to follow the script perfectly. Probably ways that are in punk, they're probably great they're not following the script perfectly. But within social movements, I see a tendency that I think is really harmful to kind of be very punitive to people who kind of step outside boundaries or who might not know the nuances, like kids who might not know the nuances of certain etiquette and stuff like that, and to really push them away quickly. And I think that stuff was super damaging. I saw that. I think I would not have been attuned to that had I not come from seeing it and participated it myself in the hardcore scene. But I see it playing out too in social movements. You see the same dynamics at play. And you read about all these leftist radical movements in the U.S. that splintered into a million pieces for these reasons. Absolutely.
Well, it's funny you say that. The first time I ever saw Earth Crisis, walking up to the show, there were some kids out front smoking, like outside the show smoking. And there was a person out there with huge 90s X's on their hands, screaming at them like, how dare you be out here smoking? We're at an Earth Crisis show. We're about straight edge. Now, of course, the band had nothing to do with it. And I don't know how they would have felt. Probably mortified because they were kids coming to see the show. And I remember I wasn't straight edge at the time. And I was with two of my friends who both smoked. And we were all like, oh, what do we do? And my friends, I'm not kidding, they went and hid in the woods to smoke between bands. They're like, we don't want to get yelled at by that straight edge person. So you get just that taste of kind of empowerment because you're part of something important, and it is important. These ideas are important, but then it's like it's so easy and tempting just to turn that power and that passion on someone to the left or right and blow up their world. And I mean, again, not just part of punk and hardcore. We see that everywhere.
Absolutely. And
we also see it in our jobs where people get like picked on, blown up, like, people like get attacked. We do a lot of what we call 360 assessments. And I've ever had something like that done before.
Is that like a review? Is that like a review of oneself? Like where people comment? Is that where a workplace all gives an assessment of you?
Yeah. You pick between like 8 to 12 people, and they get, and each person is interviewed individually about you, and then you get that feedback, and we put it through like a process. And like lots of companies do it, we do it in a way that's kind of governed.
Do you facilitate it? Do you facilitate it within companies? Or,
yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah. Well, we never do. I don't believe in doing ones that are like just like a multiple choice clicking online. Like we never do survey, what we call survey style. We don't email things because I feel like for mid-level managers, those are kind of effective because you're just getting generalist feedback. But like, let's say there's like 50 questions or 40 questions or even 30 questions and something like that. You know how it is when you've got like a bunch of questions and there's 5 choices. Mm-hmm. The first 5 you're paying attention to, but after that you're like, I just want this to be over. So we interview people directly. And one of the things I tell people about when we do the feedback, because we have a whole process that's governed by like psychological process and all that. When we're doing the feedback, the thing I tell people is like, hey, feedback can be accurate, meaning you see it in yourself and you've actually noticed it in yourself, or you've received this feedback before and you actually acknowledge that's a part of it. And now you're just getting feedback from people who are going to further support that hypothesis. So it can be accurate. It could be inaccurate, meaning it's not that you think it's wrong, like you're rejecting it, but it could just be that you have a blind spot and you don't see that in yourself. Or what it could be is that it actually is inaccurate. So someone who's very influential has, for whatever reason, formed an opinion about you. And it could be that they formed an opinion about you and they're just very charismatic and they're able to influence people around them. Or it could be that they feel threatened by you, angry at you, they want your job, they want you out of the space. So they're and they're charismatic and they're intentionally forming an opinion. Or it could have been true at one point in your career and you've stayed in the same business group or same company and it's no longer true about you, but that reputation has followed you. So something that is that you'd say is inaccurate could just straight up be wrong, or it could have been right at some point, or it's not right at all. And then of course there's neutral, that's another way we engage with it. Whatever feedback is, it's like, I want to be curious. Like, is this a perception that's held and it's an inaccurate perception and it's totally inaccurate? Or is it a perception that's held that was once actually true, but is no longer true? Or is this thing just total bullshit? It's not true at all. Because that's different ways of interacting with feedback. If something's true, then you got to figure out how you want to address it, or if you want to address it. If it was once true, but no longer is, then you want to figure out how you change that perception to reflect who you are today. And if it's not true at all, that's then why would you try and change? Like, why would you go out and try and change your behavior instead of changing the perception? So it's like getting feedback is super crucial, but not all feedback requires you do something with it. It's about understanding where the feedback's from, how does it relate to you, and then what do you want to do with it?
How do you facilitate people? Do you help people filter feedback that might be distortive? Mm-hmm. How do you facilitate what that was? Because I mean, I'm glad I haven't done a 360 review. I'm a delicate flower, and so I myself would be, and I get my student evaluations, and I boy, is that a tough tough part of the year. Or when I submit for peer review, we get anonymous, terrible, brutal anonymous feedback on the research we do. These things really affect me. And my inclination is to immediately believe everything that's being said to me. How do you handle that?
Well, and so there's an interesting pull here because there's a lot of people who will instantly believe it. If someone said it, it's true. Oh. I'm terrible. And they go all the way, right? Or the other approach is that's totally not true. That person's full of shit. They're out to get me. It's totally like, and
I wish I was that person.
Well, it's interesting because neither one of those approaches is effective, right? Because they're both ways of actually not engaging with feedback. Even if you're the person that's like, oh, it's totally true, I'm the worst. Well, you're actually not engaging with the feedback because you're completely buying into something that can't possibly be 100% correct, right?
Yes.
So are you familiar with thematic analysis?
No.
It's something that's used in psychology. So it's essentially like what we do is we interview people. Let's say we interview 10 people. We interview 10 people and we use standard questions for each person, but then we also use questions that are based on what's happening in the moment in the conversation. And this is another reason why we don't do surveys is because like I want to like follow the trail. So for example, if I ask someone a question like how someone is a communicator and they're like, oh, they're terrible. Oh my God, they're awful. And their ability to respond to that way with that strength, I'm suddenly curious what their next answer is going to be because is their next answer something where they have to really think about it or is their next answer locked and loaded? Because if their next answer is locked and loaded, that means it's something they've talked about. And like they've been able to express themselves about before. And if they've expressed themselves about it before, then it means it's like, this is either probably something they're something they've talked to other people about. It could be their partner, could be their friends, could be their coworkers. And now suddenly I'm interested in like, okay, well, just because someone's talking about it doesn't mean it's true. But then if I ask them the follow-up question and I'm like, okay, so what is it that sucks about the way they communicate? And they're like, well, and then if they're uncertain, then it's based more on a feeling than something. It's usually based more on something that they've got feelings about rather than they've got like salient examples on. And it usually says they also haven't been like talking about it. The way you can tell when people have been talking about it by their ability to express it clearly and directly in like a really clear way.
Because it's been consolidated into like an idea. It's been consolidated into an idea that they can verbal. I see.
But then you also make a note that as you're talking to the rest of the people on this list, if other people are saying the same thing, but using the same words and the same sentence structure, then you can see that people have actually been talking about it with each other. Mm-hmm. And then you become more curious about like, okay, tell me about that. So we get all of this data and we take really, really intense and like really, well, not intense, but we take really thorough notes. And then what we look for are the things that are thematically relevant. So what percentage of the audience has said this thing? And then how clear did they say it? And we put it through this whole scaling system. Mm-hmm. And then we create a report. And the report is basically like, here are the things that are thematically relevant. This percentage of your audience, it has to cross a certain percentage of the audience for it to be thematically relevant. And then within that audience, here's what degree of clarity they were speaking about it with. So we break it down. So instead of getting feedback like, you suck, it's the like, you know, like it would be basically saying like, this is what amount of your audience says you suck on this specific thing. And here's the level of clarity with which they're speaking about that.
Yes.
It allows people to be more pragmatic about how they interact with feedback.
Because it can be de-biased in this way or kind of, because it can be contextualized a little more through the system, through this, is it like a psychometric thing? What is it called again?
Thematic analysis.
Thematic.
Yeah. Check it out. Okay. It's an interesting way. So it's kind of like my take on thematic analysis, because the thematic, like true, pure psychological thematic analysis has like the system I'm discussing with you is like very complex that we use, but true thematic analysis is like even like further. Sure. It's like I'd say our approach is like heavily informed by thematic analysis. It's a cool way of basically saying like, it's a cool way of getting real deal feedback that as best as you can isn't biased by like human knee-jerk reaction to things. So for example, like if you put out a record and someone's like, your band sucks, it's like, okay, cool, tell me about it. And then if they can speak to why your band sucks. So for example, if I say Earth Crisis, and like, Earth Crisis. Okay, well, tell me about it. And you start breaking it down, and then you figure out like, well, no, actually this person is a true fan of music. Like they actually like music. And not only do they like music, they actually also really are into ideas, and they're really into like political thinking. You're like, okay, well, this is a person who actually has some good background to be able to say what is a good or a bad band and what is a good or bad way of thinking. Then I want like of thinking about politics. You start breaking that down more. Well, how much do you like, for example, do you like heavy music, or do you like hardcore? Do you like punk? Do you like punk adjacent bands? And then with social around ideas, it's like, well, what are the political people that you do follow? Who has done it right? I want to understand, is someone's opinion informed, and so that it should actually have like a little bit of weight versus uninformed. And just because someone's opinion is uninformed doesn't mean they've got something bad to add. Sure. It's just that you place it in the right place in terms of the feedback. Sure. So for example, let's say someone's opinion was uninformed, and there was like 3 people who had uninformed opinions, and they're all saying the exact same thing. It's like, this person's a jerk. It doesn't mean that their opinions are unimportant. It could mean that like, maybe this person's just a jerk to certain levels of people in their organization. Maybe they view certain people as being like, you shouldn't be in this conversation. Or maybe that person was a jerk to one of those people, and that person went out and populated that idea with it. Or maybe one of those people felt threatened by that person. There's all sorts of ways that you interact with the feedback. But essentially what we're trying to do is like, we want people to get feedback, but we don't want people to feel attacked by the feedback. We want them to be like, oh, like almost as if you went to, like, let's say you had flat arches, and the person who we're working with is like, you have flat arches. You wouldn't take that as insult. You'd be like, oh, awesome. So like, I need some. It's just empirical.
It's this empirical thing. It's a description of the state of my body. It's a description of me. Yeah.
So it's like, here's the feedback that you're getting about your leadership style or your style as a professional. The idea is I want people to be viewing it from the most pragmatic way as possible, so that they can engage with it
as observers to their own. I see.
Exactly.
What which for me is like just. That completely allows me to take critiques much better. When it's I'm just like a dispassionate observer of the things being told to me, it puts me in a much better, more receptive state to kind of hear the hard truths or to imbibe things. And that it kind of reminds me and this is something, but you were talking about, is this called thematic? What was it?
Thematic analysis.
Thematic analysis. So I'm thinking of like all this, I talk to psychologists a lot. Friends, they tend to be thoughtful people, but I noticed that the heterogeneity in the approaches, the schools of thought. I do compassion-based stuff. I'm into I'm into schema therapy. These different things, CBT. What were you drawn to stylistically? I shouldn't even say stylistically. What tools were you drawn to as a psychologist and as a counselor?
Well, CBT was like cognitive behavioral therapy was like that's where I put my focus, and very much the trans-theoretical stages of change model, which is kind of like classic addiction. I practice that in my work now. So like if I think about change and I think about it in that model, it's like the stages of change being pre-contemplative. So I'm not even considering change. And I like to apply like a question to each one, a type of question. So
I see.
Pre-contemplative, I'm not even thinking about change. So the question would be, well, why would I change? Right? That would be a pre-contemplative question. Then contemplative, which is you're now kind of considering change, but it'd be like, well, what would I change? Because now you've gone beyond why would I change? You're like, okay, I understand why I changed, but what would I change? Because now you're trying to frame up what you're agreeing to.
Yes.
And then the next one would be preparation. And that's how would I change? Action, which is now you're actively engaged in it. The question here is, how am I doing? This is where there'd be a lot of feedback on how well someone's doing. And then it would be maintenance is the last one. So maintenance would be, how do I keep this going? How do I do this? And then also, if you're really interested in change, would be, well, what's next? And I apply that in my therapeutic practice, but I apply that a ton as a coach. And I apply that to like leadership all the time because like organizations, and you might have experienced this, they're always changing. Like I love when leaders are like, we are in a time of change. Oh, really? Like, no, like really?
Just a bear shit in the woods, Yeah, it's like, yeah.
Everything's changing all the time. You're always in a time of change. But when organizations, like big or small, are creating change, I find that they usually populate the ideas in the wrong place. So where they're trying to take people is they usually start in the preparation stage or even the action stage. They'll announce a change and then be like, either it's like, here's the change and here's how we're going to do it. Or here's the change, here are your marching orders. Like they either we're going to start, like they announce the change and here's how we're going to go, or here's the change and this is what you need to do. And that's why a lot of change initiatives are so like herky-jerky. It's like 100% of your population. When I think about change, it's like break it down into 3 ways. And it's what I call the 20-20-60 rule. You got 20% of people who are champions. You could tell them like whatever the change is, they are change-minded people. And they're like, yeah, like whatever it is, we're going to do it. And even if it sucks, they're like, okay, that sucks, but we're going to figure it out. 20% champions. Then you got 20% detractors. These are people that are like, even if the change is something they like, they're like, nah, well, you should have done it like this. Like they always have some opinion. The battle for change is never with either of those because the champions are going to do it no matter what. And the detractors are going to hate on it no matter what. The battle is always for that 60% in the middle. These are the neutral people. And neutral people actually need to be taken through that whole stage as a change model. And some of the people in that population are going to get it very quickly and move from stage to stage to stage. Some are going to take longer, but I want you to think more like the median of it. The median of that group, you have to gradually take them through the stages of change model. You have to like tell them like, this is why we're going to be making change. You got to introduce the idea and get that pre-contemplative conversation going on. Then when you get into contemplative, okay, this is how or this is what is going to change. Yes. Then you get them into preparation. This is how we're going to do it. Yes. You always focus on getting the median of the neutral group to move in that stage of change. And like when it comes to detractors, they will be sucked along with the momentum of
just by gravity.
Group. Yeah, just by gravity. And then the champions are probably going to be a stage ahead, like racing. Like let's do it. Let them get there. The battle is never with the detractors because the detractors, they're not good or bad people. They're just people. They're just normal people, but they will suck up all of your energy. You could give them the best plan with the best reason and they'll be like, well, what about this? And you're like, oh my God, what's wrong with you? And all of this really, what I'd say is like kind of like base level psychology. It's like I apply this every single day in every single conversation I have. It's about how do you help people make the changes that are good for them, good for their teams, good for their businesses.
I see. Yeah. And did you stumble on this model? So is this part of a school of thought, or is this like kind of just your own lens by which you view organizational change, given what you do for a living, or is this kind of a systematic thing that you came to through a school of thought, through a school of thought, but then this is my own take on it.
Adaptation
of it.
Yeah, like CBT, like, they're, and trans-theoretical stages of change model. So trans-theoretical meaning that many schools of psychology would be playing with these ideas. It's a very rudimentary psychological tool. So like, it's like the most kind of like very like, year one learning as a therapist.
I see.
That 20-20-60 rule is something that I came up with, and then
empirically observing the types of like organizations you have to. So is that really what you're focused on? Is helping organizations go through types of change?
Individuals, teams, and organizations.
I see.
Well, and when I think about it, and that's what my organization does two things. One is leadership. And leadership could be an individual, it could be a team, it could be an organization. So it could be like for one person, a team of people, or just the organization. We're trying to change the leadership and change the culture in a healthy way. And then the other is communication training. So like how to give a good presentation, how to answer questions effectively, how to have tough conversations, how to write well. What I spend my day with is working with CEOs or C-suite or very, very, very senior level professionals, just because I've been doing it for so long. But we work with people from all different levels of the organization.
That's amazing. What is it? And by C-suite individuals, are you working with them on individual change or change within the C-suite? Okay. What are, very curious. So is this a long-term, how long-term of a relationship are you forming with these people, these C-suite people, or these people that you're working with when you're working with individuals doing individual change?
My longest C-suite relationship would be 9 years.
Wow.
I usually work with people like ongoing for years and years and years. And that doesn't mean they're engaging with our whole organization. And also sometimes I work with someone for like 2 years and then we'll pause and we won't work together for like a year or two and they'll come back. The way that I look at it is that I'm here to help people when they're trying to really achieve something. And that achieving something, it's just like if you were, let's say you were never a runner, but you got in your head, I'm going to run a marathon.
Yeah.
And that's totally doable. It's doable for most people. It's doable for most people with most abilities. And it's not doable for every single person, but it's doable for most people. For some people, it's as easy as getting up and being like, you know what, I'm just going to run and they're going to figure it out. And that's a very small percentage of the population. For other people, they need some kind of resource. And it could just be like a running app. It could be like something you follow online. For other people, it could be like joining a running group. For other people, it could be getting like a coach or a running partner, someone who's really like good, a running mentor. And that's kind of like the scope of coaching. Like, well, what are you trying to do? Is it an enormous thing? Okay. Are you one of that little percentage of people who can just do it? Great. That's awesome. Or do you need just a slight intervention? Like, do you need an app, or do you need this and this and this? And that kind of like gauges up how much I or my company would engage.
Yeah.
I'm real cautious about like overcommitting into helping individuals, teams, or organizations, because like you should just help the way that they need, rather than like, because very often people be like, again for running, be like, I need a running coach. It's like, no, you don't. You just need this app. Always give people what they really need rather than what they think they need, because what they really need is going to get them further, and they'll maintain a better relationship with you.
I see.
Man, well, let's get to you, man. We're running low on time. I got to talk about you.
I'm sorry. I'm curious about the coaching stuff because I'm just curious because you're working with super high performance people who are trying to grow, and I'm surrounded by very high performance people, and I'm just always trying to observe them. And they're peculiar people. They're weird people, and I'm always just learning a lot from how people are kind of going through change. And these people who are much smarter than me, or I should rather say much more talented than me. And I'm always curious about people who are experts and somehow growing and tackling things and pursuing change in some way. And I'm curious from your vantage point, I don't mean to ask you questions. I'm just stating my own curiosity, my own fascination is that like, you must see this day in and day out. And I'm curious what types of things you must learn, because you must learn a lot from these types of weirdos amazing people that you work with. And, because I learn it from these people I'm around all day.
This is what I've learned. And I'm going to put it into terms of hardcore. You could put out one cool record, or you could put out a lot of cool records, and it depends on your willingness to have someone help you. So for example, there are very few people who can run the marathon on their own, from the couch to running the marathon. So there are very few people who just off their own talent and vision can write a ton of cool records. Walter Schreifels from Gorilla Biscuits, Quicksand. He's one of those few people who could like just get up and be like, I'm going to run a marathon. I don't need any help. I'm going to figure it out.
Yes.
Because he's just a unbelievably talented person. And he really hasn't run out of runway. Like he could just keep writing great records, help other people.
Keeps doing cool stuff. Yeah.
Right. But then there are people who are like, really, really talented, but they kind of hit a ceiling. And so let's talk about like Capo and Porcel. It's like, oh man, the Youth of Today records are like unreal, right? Shelter, they're kind of figuring it out. And they're doing, I love Shelter, but like they hit, the reason Mantra is such a cool record is because they had a producer, and the producer, who was also their engineer, pushed them. And I was just listening to the Meet Meep podcast. Shout out to Meet Meep. Great podcast if anyone's interested in Roadrunner Records and the history of Roadrunner Records. It's
that's amazing.
It's so amazing. It's so good. You got to check it out.
And that's a great name.
Yeah, and he's going through every single catalog number of Roadrunner and doing these deep dive ones. So he did one on Mantra and interviewed those guys.
Oh,
And those
amazing.
guys were able to write a next level record. Now, these are people who had written tons of cool records, but they knew to get to that next level, they needed a producer. And that's what a coach does, right? It's like they help you refine your ideas and help you push it. And then they wrote Mantra, and it's this incredible, incredible record.
Yeah.
And then you got people who can write a cool record one time, but then they're kind of like, I don't know what to do, but they don't go and get help. It's like most people can write. If you're talented and focused, most people can write a cool record. Not everyone can write a cool follow-up. Most cool follow-ups require someone to help you, and or like great collaboration or different influences so you can get pushed. And just not everybody has first, like not everyone can afford to get like, in music, a producer or
amazing producer.
Yeah. Or let's say professionally, like a coach or a mentor, any of those things. But it's that idea that for you to not just replicate success, but to get better and better and better and better, you need someone who knows how to stretch you. And for someone to know how to stretch you, you got to look for someone who's like a professional at helping people like get to that next space. I know a ton of CEOs so I know some CEOs who are like Walter Schreifus. Like they're just like, you don't need any help. You are just like beyond the beyond. Yeah. Good for you. I salute you. That's awesome. I know a lot of professionals who are like Mantra era Shelter, who are like really got a strong track record, but for the thing they want to do, they need someone to help. And that's usually my sweet spot, is like for real, already people who've got a good track record, but now they want to do the next thing.
Yes.
And then I've seen a lot of CEOs who've hit a space and they're like, okay, I've done pretty good. If they're willing to get a coach, then they can explore, can they have a great follow-up next? But if they're unwilling to get a coach, it's like, yeah, you might replicate success a little, but eventually you're going to drop off because you can't just keep knocking out the hits. I was just very recently like kind of saw a transition of a CEO who's like, yeah, you did a hit record, man, but like you kind of blew it because you were unwilling to get help or to have someone stretch you. You're just too ignorant. Like you believe your own shit too much. And they
right
blew
there. Believing your own shit. I feel like I know a lot of people, and what I do, and it might have an analog with music too, but and I'm getting excited because what you're saying is like, oh, this is like hitting me, and it's something I think about a lot because I'm around a lot of high performing people who are really, really smart. But in what I do, there's this mythology of like the lone genius. Everyone's a lone genius. I'm sure it's CEO. It's like you're some Ubermensch, fountainhead like person who just is ascendant, and you do it all yourself. You're a rugged individualist. Within academia, there's this kind of mythology of, oh, you're just a lone genius and you should do this all on your own. And that growth is like a fully kind of, you're an atomized person just pursuing things. So people, I don't think I myself am faulty for this, don't pursue this because there's this kind of idea that you should perhaps do all this in and of your own self, and that we're smart enough to do it. And it's like, no, I'm not. I'm very hyper specialized in very certain things, but when it comes to growth and pushing myself, it's like, I don't know that. I could absolutely use a coach. I could absolutely use someone to help me facilitate grow, realizing what I want to realize. But we're too stubborn to do those things. And so I don't see any of this in my world. I think we could really benefit from it. At least, yeah. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. And this is, again, I don't know in your experience, but I remember when I was younger, I never sought out a mentor. And I didn't grow up again with a strong family system. So like I didn't have that kind of connection to my parents where they really they gave me good values, but they didn't help me kind of like form up being an adult. I had to figure out a lot of that myself. And also it made me like ignorant. Like I was like, I don't need anyone's help. I got it, Yes. I know so much. And I hit a point where I was like, oh shit, I've never had a mentor. I don't know anything about being a CEO. I don't know anything about being a business. And I've actually gone out and like sought out mentors, and I've become very interested in surrounding myself with and when I say successful, I don't mean monetarily successful, but I'm a firm believer in surround yourself with successful people, but it's about how you define success. So for example, let's say you were very interested in being a great parent. Surround yourself with people that you are successful parents. If you're very interested in being a great athlete, but an athlete that is excels athletically, but is also like well balanced, interacts with people well, has good levels of self-care, then find people who are successful with that. You should always know what you want to be successful in and be very specific. Like, for example, if someone's like, well, I want to be financially successful. Well, that's not specific enough. Like really break it down.
Yeah.
Seek out those people and develop relationships with them, because it's going to be a game changer for you. Because you'll understand their process. Most people are very willing to share with you and to offer advice and to help. But not only that, being around people who have a strong track record of success in these very specific ways, they carry themselves in a way that is very refreshing if you're someone who's like searching for something like that.
Yes, yes, yes. And that's a world that I wasn't aware of until I kind of like started being around high-performing people outside of academia. In academia, I think we do have a mentorship-mentee system, but it's institutionalized to the extent that I think we almost devalue it a bit. And what I mean is that like we just have this. I mean, you've done a degree, you have an advisor, and usually is this, and there isn't a lot of effort put in kind of the role of being a mentor, the role of what that means to like fulfill that role and embody that role. And when I started being around psychologists and one of my best friends is a coach here, and the idea of purposefully seeking out mentors was something I was like, people do that? Like people do that? And that was completely foreign to me. I never realized, it never occurred to me, because I'm like, I have this kind of thick-headed mindset of like you have to do it all on your own. But this idea that, people go out there and are very serious about mentorship. I also do a lot with finance too. It's like mentorship is really normal there. And I'm just now starting it took me a long time to realize the importance of that process. And that's an even possibility. That's the thing people do. There's a world that I didn't really appreciate. And that I myself, as a mentor to students, now take that role much more seriously. Wait, do you mentor people are you a mentor yourself? Like to people within your and other?
Well, in my organization, I support the people that work in the company, but I mentor business people. What I typically do is like very often, and I'm a little reticent to say this on the podcast, but usually what I do is there's a couple people that come to me a year, and I just coach them for free based on where they're at in their life, especially if they're in a tough spot. Usually I take on a couple coaching people. So for example, if someone's in a spot where they have a really challenging, toxic workspace and it's just breaking them down mentally and they just can't handle it, I'll usually take on one or two of those a year just to help out. And then I do a lot of mentorship for professionals who are just stuck in their career, but they don't need coaching. They just need mentorship. Would you mind if I shared with you like the model that I talk about when I talk about like mentoring and coaching and everything?
Yeah, totally.
So mentoring, from my perspective, is such an incredibly valuable thing. But you're here someone where you're giving advice. You're influencing thinking, right? And there's a lot of influencing thinking. And there's a ton of advice given, but you're not putting your chips down. You're not saying, I'm actually part of your development. Like I'm invested in your development, and I'm actually like in a way responsible for your development. Mentorship, from my perspective, is super healthy. It's basically someone that you can go and bring ideas to, and they can help reframe your thinking from an influential. It's more influencing thinking.
Got it.
And there's no responsibility of the mentor for someone's success at all. And
this is an important intellectual distinction too. No, this is interesting.
So that's one way that's how I look at mentoring. I look at coaching as a totally different thing.
Yes.
So coaching is influencing someone's thinking. That's all you're doing. You're just trying to get them to think about something. And you're not necessarily responsible for the outcome. Instructing is showing someone how to do something. So it's like, oh, you're doing this thing. Here's a dartboard. I'm going to show you how to throw a dart and get it closer in there. This is how you stand. This is how you throw. This is like all of that stuff. And you get them to do it, improve through iteration, go over and over and over again. Coaching lies in the middle of those two. Coaching is about framing up someone's thinking, and it's also about teaching people skill. And depending on what you're working on, it could have like a higher percentage of like influencing their thinking and a little bit of skill, or lots of skill and like a little bit of thinking. So a driving instructor is someone who is coaching someone, because they're not just instructing someone on how to drive. They're also, if they're like really serious about what they're doing, they're also giving them a philosophy of thought about how do you think about
Yes.
driving? How do you be a good member? How do you be like a good community member of the road? How do you think about if someone cuts you off? How do you think about that in a way that you don't become aggressive or get into road rage? And actually, how do you give people like sympathy and mercy when you're on the road to understand that, well, driving is complex and people make mistakes, or maybe someone just came from having a bad breakup, or maybe something happened with their kid. Maybe they're driving like an asshole, and you can extend them that kind of mercy. Like a great driving instructor is coaching people because they're showing them the mechanics of driving, but also the philosophy of thought. And that to me is coaching. And if you're in a coaching relationship with someone, you're typically assuming some kind of responsibility for where they go next. And it doesn't mean that if they fail at something, like, if a driver instructor, if someone gets in a car accident like 5 days after they're done, they shouldn't get in trouble for it.
Sure.
But you are invested in the outcome, that you want someone to be able to get good at what you're doing rather than just giving them advice. So I view mentorship as like really, really important, but it's not that level of like, I'm assuming some level of responsibility for you, where coaching is like, I am assuming some level of responsibility for what happens next.
No, it makes total sense.
Now we're heading off towards the end. Everyone, we're going to do a part 2 of this because, like, as we got into it, like I said, we're starting a longer format, and it allows us to have like a richer conversation, which is super cool. But the thing that we didn't get to do is, Nathan, we didn't get to really talk about your world, which I am super fascinated with. So we're going to set up a part 2, and then I'm not sure how we'll stagger these, whether we'll do them back to back or what we'll do, but we'll see what happens. But we're definitely doing a part 2. All right. So as we close off, I have 3 questions for you.
Absolutely.
Okay. First, if you think about leadership, how does that play out in your role today?
If I think about leadership, how it plays out in my role today, it's complicated because I embody like kind of multiple roles as a leader, both as like a researcher, as a professor. You kind of have you're kind of split between these two worlds. People usually think it's just teaching, but it's like, so I teach and advise students, and that's great. And there's a very specific kind of formulaic role as a leader that I kind of embody there. But most of my time is spent as a researcher and working in groups, having to kind of get people to believe in my terrible ideas that we're trying to implement, and projects that take forever and that are kind of very costly and very strange, and that take coordinate. I was just on the call with my colleagues in Korea, and having to kind of deal with multiple people towards a very kind of risky goal, battling between time zones, competing interests, et cetera, having to wrangle these people together and inspire them to commit to a project and to fulfill very weird projects that are high risk and fail a lot and take a long time to pay off. My role as a leader spent a lot there trying to manage that and trying to kind of work with a team and kind of being emotionally intuitive and trying to get people on board with what we're doing, whether it's our research assistants or whether it's my other PIs, my other principal investigators as well, who might get depressed, or et cetera, et cetera. Does that answer the question at all?
It does. So I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. Based on that, where do you know you're really good in that leadership role? Like, where do you know you've got like really a strong approach? And also, where do you know that you've got real challenges that you got to work on?
Yeah.
Start with the good though.
Start with the good. It's always, and it's a terrifying question because you're always like, what if I'm not good at this? What if like, so as a psychologist, you can probably see the gears in my brain turning and like the self-doubt pouring over me. But what I'd say I'm good at is like, I think I'm pretty good. It goes back to the conversation we had earlier. It's like, I think I'm pretty good at understanding, having some emotional intelligence about, in particular, the people under me, in particular, like who don't have authority within the project, understanding where their strengths are, understanding what their style of work might be, and trying to inspire them to be involved in a project and have a voice within the project. And also, and so kind of understanding emotionally where they're coming from and what drives them and where their strengths are. That's, I think, a real, like one of my strengths as a PI and as a leader within projects.
Okay. Challenges. Where do you know you need to get better?
Challenges. Speaking up. I'm too delicate and I have terrible boundaries. Terrible boundaries. I know that's something I need to get better at. Terrible boundaries. And I'm bad at being confrontational and speaking up and delivering news that might be unfortunate and might kind of hurt someone or might have the potential to hurt someone. It actually might not. People are much more thick-skinned than I am. But in delivering hard realities and truths to people, I'm terrible at it. Terrible, especially my peers and people above me. That's where got to work on that.
Well, thank you for the vulnerability. Let's talk about that next time because I got some ideas that I'm gonna throw past you there.
Okay.
All right. The last question is the hardest question of all. You can change this. Think about like someone afterwards might be like, "What? That was your answer?" Think about it. It could be different anytime based on whatever your mood is. So I won't hold this to you.
No. Okay.
3 best hardcore records from Florida.
Oh my God. I got to think about this. Oh.
Punk too. It could be punk hardcore.
On the spot, I might have to get back to you on this. Cause do I go with Roach Motel, the old hardcore stuff? Do I go with, Yeah, this is a tough one. I'm going to start with punk. This is going to be a weird one, left field. I Hate Myself, self-titled on No Idea Records. I think it's the self-titled one. Brutally beautiful, emotional, amazing album. I love it. It fits a very specific time and place in Florida punk rock history. Ass Suck, Misery Index might be unlistenable to some people. Great grind album. I think an amazing grind album. Grind aficionados might disagree with me there, but I'm gonna take a stand there. Other one. What would be? Oh, Reversal Man, Revolutionary Summer 10-inch. Beautiful, inspiring lyrics. Great call out to Earth Crisis there. They have a kind of confrontational Earth Crisis, anti-Earth Crisis song. It's fantastic. Those would be 3 records, I think, that are, I'm going to come up with other ones. I'm going to doubt my list when I get off this, but those are the 3 that kind of resonate, kind of stick in my craw right now. Those are kind of,
I love it, man. All right. Well, listen, as we're closing off, we're definitely doing a part 2. So everyone, know that one's coming. Anything that you want to plug, anything you want to mention, where can people find you? Oh, we forgot to mention your Twitter handle. What's your Twitter handle? I
have the Straight Edge Twitter, @StraightEdge on Twitter. You can find me. The CM Punk fans find me. Random people find me and are disappointed that it's like a guy talking about economics. Find me on Twitter. That's the best place to find me. Sodalabs.io is a lab I'm affiliated with. I have another lab coming up that'll be public. I have a Linktree, Linktree, / Nathan Lane. You can find all my stuff there, all my podcasts and articles there. So
heck yeah. Awesome. So everyone check out, he's the first straight edge person on Twitter, obviously, since he got straight edge. The second straight edge person must have been like, God damn it, I missed that one.
Yeah.
So congratulations on that great handle. You got it. You've got it in perpetuity. Everyone check out Nathan's Linktree. Check out all the links in there, his podcast, all his work he's done. It's very compelling. And man, thank you so much for being on the show, and we'll see you in the next one.
I loved it. Thank you so much. Your team is great. Thanks for having me. This was fun.
Absolutely. All right, man. I will talk to you soon. And everybody, we'll see you in the outro. Spencer, drop the beat.